I would be remiss if we did not cover in our discussion of federal laws also regulations and areas of compliance. So that is indeed what we are going to discuss today. We see and hear in the news almost every single day another bulletin about data breaches. And with this rash of occurrences, legislative bodies are really, they're not trusting organizations to protect their own data. And with that said, I'm going to now share my screen. And we will begin our discussion about cybersecurity as it relates specifically to regulations around the protection of personally identifiable information. And as I just said, legislative bodies, Congress, also unelected officials in the various cabinet positions, the directors of the Department of Energy, the Department of Health and Human Services, the National Security Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, all of these various entities are no longer trusting various both private and public organizations to properly protect their own data. Most recently, here in the United States, the New York Department of Financial Services brought charges against a particular company that knew about its control weaknesses from, the quote says, at least October of 2014, possibly all through the time period up until May 2019, and basically ignored its internal experts and chose to really do nothing to remediate the situation. Ultimately, this inaction left close to 1,000 records containing non-public personal information exposed. While not all organizations ignore cybersecurity in such an egregious manner, stories like these give governmental bodies reason to distrust corporate cybersecurity. And although no one has a crystal ball, most security professionals agree that newer and more stringent regulations will only continue to be enacted over the next 5 to 10 years. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the current laws and industry standards to provide some insights into what we call controls. Those are areas and policies and procedures that an organization would put into place to lock down their data, protect their data. There are many various regulations, stipulations, compliances, and it would take probably a week nonstop to go over them all. So we will look today at the top 5 most important of these regulations. Most standards and regulations somewhat mimic one another, although there are some landmark laws and standards that exist and persist. But here's the top 5. And I'm sure you have heard of some of these acronyms just by being in tune with news and discussions amongst your peers. So we'll start the conversation with HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, put in place in 1996. We'll also discuss the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, Sarbanes-Oxley Act, slightly newer in 2002, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, sometimes in writing referred to as the PCI DSS, and lastly on our list of top 5, GDPR, which is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. GDPR, as you'll soon learn, is a very overarching standard, and even though it's enacted or emanating from the European Union, its reach is really far larger than that. Before we go on, I thought that we would have a poll. So there's 2 questions. Yes, there are right and wrong answers, but you're not going to get graded on it. It's just curious for me and a learning moment for you. So we'll launch the poll and see what your knowledge is regarding some of the items from the Identity Theft Resource Center. So the first item asks, according to the Identity Theft Resource Center, their report just from last year, how many data breaches were there in 2021? And then when you get a chance, we'll look down at the second question, same Identity Theft Research Center, research organization, how many reported, what was the increase in the number of breaches during 2021 compared to the previous year? So I just give you a few moments to think about those, take your best stab at it, and we'll come back to that in a moment. All right, so we'll wait a moment on that, and we'll share the results. Okay. All right, so most people indicated that there were 1,862 data breaches in 2021. And don't know if you Googled that or not, but that is correct. That equates to 5 a day, would you say? So that's quite concerning. And the increase from 2021 to from 2020 to 2021 happened to be about 17%. So that is interesting as well. So let's talk a bit about HIPAA. It's one of those acronyms that I think you hear a lot about, specifically when you're at the doctor's office or unfortunately, have to make a trip to the emergency room. It is one of the very first broad-reaching security and privacy laws here in the US. And although targeted at healthcare organizations and associates of healthcare, HIPAA really is the first broad-reaching security and privacy law. It consists of 4 rules, one called the security rule. Then there's the privacy rule, the breach notification rule, and the enforcement rule. And in the year 2013, the Department of Health and Human Services, that's the agency that enforces HIPAA, announced the Omnibus Rule, which implemented multiple provisions in the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, which has the cool acronym HITECH, HITECH. And the Omnibus Rule applied 4 penalty tiers based on violation categories that ranged from what they called unknowing violations, and that had a $100 penalty, all the way up to a $50,000 per violation fine for willful neglect. And it's just important for us technology folks to recognize that the controls and rules that are embedded into HIPAA are verified. The evidence to provide or to prove compliance is often verified in event logs. Those are the data that is stored from servers, network devices, desktops, and that log data is critical to not only providing insights for the system administrators, but also for creating the reports that that show compliance. The Graham-Leachy-Bliley Act, more easily referred to as the GLBA, and also in the common vernacular referred to as the Financial Services Modernization Act, protects consumer financial privacy. So an important thing to protect. In 2019, so not too many years ago, the Federal Trade Commission solicited some public comments on a modernization rule to update the law, specifically to align better with digital transformation cybersecurity concerns. GLBA, in its legislation verbiage, does not directly mention event logs, but despite this, there are provisions that allude to it. There's a provision that says financial institution safeguards. It reads specifically, in furtherance of the policy in subsection A, each agency or authority described in section 505A shall establish appropriate standards for the financial institutions subject to their jurisdiction relating to administrative, technical, and physical safeguards. That's sort of a mouthful, and it is. And one thing, if you don't take away any other big lesson, you should recognize that the codifying of policy and compliance standards into legal verbiage is it's an exact exercise. So you'll often find very lengthy and verbose descriptions when you're talking about both statutes and regulations. We see mention again to event logs. They are key in providing visibility into anomalies, into things that are like an unexpected outlier, activities that would signal potential data security events. And that'll be a common thread through all that we speak about today, is the very importance of event logs and being able to glean information from those logs. We'll also learn, not just today, but throughout this course and others that you'll take in the system security curriculum, that the ability to make sense of data that's in these logs is just critical to the information security engineer, the system administrator, and other knowledge workers in the business. And there have been a variety of specialized systems. SIEM is one that you'll, an acronym that you'll come across, security incident and event management systems that are employed within large companies, just to always be monitoring and keeping a finger on the pulse of the security of the system. Third on our list is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. And some of you may be old enough, or even if you're not old enough, you are familiar with the Enron incident, a big scandal and scam in the oil industry. SOX directly responded to that scam, plus others, Tyco International, WorldCom, corporate financial scandals, all happening in the early 2000s. And thus, in 2002, SOX set forth strict rules for financial reporting, mainly looking to increase investor confidence. Although organizations engaged in some digital transactions back there in 2002, the accelerated pace of digital transformation from that time up till now just exacerbates the need for oversight and some rules. So SOX set forth requirements that organizations prevent insider fraud by establishing what it's called segregation of duties, or SOD. So what segregation of duties basically does is requires two different individuals to be involved in a very important or key transaction. For example, the same person who creates new vendor accounts in a company's payment system should not also be allowed to pay the vendors. So the goal is to remove any conflicts of interest that could enable users to engage in insider fraud. So that should be the biggest tie that you save in your memory bank about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or SOX, that it is aimed at restricting, closing loopholes for insider fraud. And as we move continually into a cloud-based environment, identity and access governance, so being able to access various systems, is fundamental in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Then we'll move on to the PCI DCS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And while HIPAA, GLBA, and SOX are regulations with the force of law, the PCI DCS is an industry standard that has prescriptive controls for organizations that collect payment. And although many see this as a compliance standard that focuses on retail, the point to be made is that any organization that accepts payment by credit card needs to meet this standard. So that would include healthcare, entertainment, and financial institutions as well. In the early 2000s, again, a lot of things seem to erupt in the early 2000s, the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council, which was formed by the 5 major card companies, Amex, Discover, JCB International, MasterCard, and Visa. They came together and created an initiative to protect cardholders from fraud. As part of that initiative, they established PCI DSS. They did that in 2004, and the standard applies penalties to those who do not comply with their prescriptions. PCI DSS in the big scheme of things consists of 12 requirements. They are clearly defined in a list of controls. And the standard does provide a clear step-by-step list of documentation that is necessary to meet the requirements. In requirement 10, for example, it stated that you must track and monitor all access to network resources and card holder data. And some of the things that are required in an audit log include actions taken by individuals with root or administrative privileges, invalid login access attempts, privilege elevation, changes, additions, or deletions to accounts that have root or administrative privileges, any stopping or pausing of audit logs. So I think you get the point about all of those actions that would be compromising to a system. And now we'll talk about the 5th major regulation, which is GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. It was put into force in 2016 and then fully implemented in 2018. So it's fairly new on the scene and considered to be a landmark data privacy regulation. So you will hear more and more about GDPR. It's good to have a general understanding of this particular regulation. If you want to break into the security area, at least a conversational knowledge of GDPR is a plus. It stands as the first regulation that provides what we'll call extraterritorial jurisdiction, not extraterrestrial, but extraterritorial, which means it applies to organizations outside of the European Union to the extent that if they collect or transmit or store any otherwise non-public personal information about EU citizens or anyone living in the EU, then they are under the GDPR. So its reach is rather extensive. Large companies like Amazon.com, Facebook, many big content distributors, they, even unbeknownst to them, could have or touch EU citizens or EU inhabitants, and thus must comply with GDPR. Under GDPR, non-compliance can lead to fines up to 10 million pounds or 10 million euros, or it could be more than that. It could be 2% of an organization's total worldwide annual turnover in the previous financial year. So a multi-billion-dollar company could be in for a big penalty. Chapter 4 in GDPR sets forth something called the data protection by design and default. And that requires companies to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures, which are designed to implement data protection principles, including data minimization, non-duplication of data. They must also implement technical and organizational measures for ensuring that by default, only personal data which is absolutely necessary for each specific purpose of the processing actually be processed. So nothing that's extraneous is to be collected. Going further into detail, there is the concept of, quote, security of processing, end quote. And this requires companies implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk, including regular testing, assessing, and evaluating of the effectiveness of their measures for ensuring that their processing is secure. So you can see that there is lots of data collection, lots of keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening, lots of assessing, and thus the positions like Chief Information Security Officer or CISO are key in these organizations. Finally, the GDPR requires organizations to notify their supervisory authorities if any data breach does occur, and they must do this within a 72-hour framework. And that notification has to include the categories of data that have been compromised, the approximate number of subjects that have been affected. They must describe the likely consequences of this personal data breach, talk about the measures being taken or proposed to be taken to address the breach, and they need to talk about the measures to mitigate any adverse effects from the breach. So having a plan in place ahead of time is going to be huge in being able to address any of the GDPR concerns. While the GDPR does not list specific event logs that must exist, the information that can be found in log data helps to proactively detect any of these potential security events. So we talked about lots and lots of different data items and areas that must be monitored, some under the force of law, and some, just as importantly, under compliance standards that hold the weight of fines, so as hefty as laws. But those can be basically categorized into what we call control groups. And we can see those on the screen in front of you. There's the identity and access management group, one we call continuous vulnerability monitoring. That would be closely tied to various log files that can give us insights, a vision into account elevations or, incorrect login attempts in multiplicity. With third category is configuration management. Identity or incident detection and response is a fourth category. Our class here at Alamance Community College, SCC 160, titled Security Administration 1, gets into some of the nuts and bolts of incident detection and response. And then the last category, the information security program adoption. So that is a more administrative or policy-driven governance look at security. So there are all these rules, all these standards. How do you possibly do it? For most of the elements of compliance, again, we go back to well-tuned server, network, and system laws. These are your data sources for evidencing that the company understands their environment and what is happening. So once the organization establishes the various controls, the various benchmarks and measures that they are setting for themselves as their risk tolerance, then they need to collect data that can alert their teams to check out the threats. Sometimes you do have false positives, and that is why we have in the security operations centers analysts that are trained to dig a little deeper and determine the veracity of those threats. So determining the most critical event logs to collect is key, because overwhelming ourselves with data can just be a lost cause. All that you can't see the forest for the trees. So judiciously deciding what data to collect and at what frequency is part of the job description of the CTO and the CISO. And as part of that continuous monitoring, the organizations, of course, have to review these logs to detect anomalies that might indicate some potential attack. And you know as well as I, you can't go through log files, a human being doing it by eye. It's impossible. So various tools have come into the marketplace. Splunk is one of them. There are others. There are some open source tools as well that allow the analyst to categorize, summarize, do some statistical analysis in order to make some judgments on what is going on. So let's just take a look at one of those control groups that we mentioned previously, identity and access management, and look at some of the things that organizations should collect when aiming to address this control group. Some of these will be familiar to you, most of them will. Device authentication and authorization, which various end devices have the authority to access which systems and services. User access to resources. So we use things like organizational units and Active Directory in Windows, and in the Linux, we have permission standards that will allow access to various files, directories, resources on the system. Every system needs to log the failed login attempts, specifically multiplicities in a short period of time. Any escalation of privilege needs to be collected. Logins from remote locations, of course, now in the age of remote workers, that becomes a little bit foggy. And then you can see the last item is logging access to specifically critical applications. Possibly one of the most egregious data breach concerns is that from insiders. There's three basic categories of insider threats. One is employees that were specifically employed looking to steal information from organizations. Sadly, that's true. But we also have workforce members that just have too much access within their job role. And they are sources of risk by purely happenstance, accidental misuse of their authorities. And then, of course, we have the entire classification of cyber criminals that use phishing and other techniques to steal user credentials. And in fact, it looks like insider activity, but it's just using an insider's credentials. In all of these cases, log data provides a visibility into what might be happening. Monitoring the user access, especially escalation of privilege, enables the security professionals to identify and protect the organization. So in closing, you can read the statement as well as I. Security professionals that have been in the field for a while recognize that compliance doesn't guarantee security, but they do go hand in hand. The main point is collecting data, documenting their security work, and if that is done correctly, when an audit arises, you're ready for the situation. So when security is the prime focus, compliance often follows in a without a thought, really. So that is really our discussion for today. And I'm going to stop my share for a minute and close out with a second poll. I'm going to launch it. And this is about ransomware payouts and various hacking. First question is that the Chinese hacking group known as Hafnium attacked Microsoft very recently. And how many record or how many, or actually how many other organizations across the US were affected by this terrible hack? So just give you a few more minutes. No. All right, so in the first question, we had most of our class indicating that they felt that, here it goes, that it was 25,000, but the answer is 30,000. And the world record for the largest payout made by an insurance company just last year was $40 million. That's a hefty price to pay. And just incidences like this are learning moments in and of themselves. If you're in an organization and you're charged with protecting their security, you can keep in the back of your mind that what you do is a valuable service to that organization. All right, hope you learned something today. We'll be looking for your presentations on the federal laws, and we'll probably transition ourselves into state statutes in the very near future. See you Wednesday.